Today was the reveal for the next Hearthstone expansion, Murder at Castle Nathria, and we got 10 new cards to look at. The first of those is going to be Prince Renathal, a 3-mana 3/4 neutral legendary. Your deck size and starting health are 40. So they recently made the change to the deck builder where you can put more than 30 cards in a deck, but then you just have to narrow it down. And of course they were never going to add a quality of life feature just for the sake of it. So now we see what their actual reason was. It's because with Prince Renathal you can build a 40 card deck. Now it should be noted that having more cards in your deck is generally a bad thing, because when you're building a deck, the first card you put in theoretically is the most powerful, and the second card you put in is the second most powerful. And then the 30th card you put in is going to be the weakest card in your deck. Well, when you increase your deck size by 10, that means you're adding 10 more cards that are weaker than the first 30 cards. Which means every turn that you draw a card, on average, that card you draw is going to be worse than if you had a 30 card deck. There are some exceptions to this being a downside. Fatigue, of course. Maybe something like in Warlock where they have all the self-mill cards. Maybe having extra cards could be nice. But generally, this is a bad thing. And even in a control meta, having cards added to your deck is going to be done better by Kazakhstan. So I think we're really looking at this as 3-mana 3/4 with a downside that makes your starting health 40. And I think looking at it through that lens, it actually still seems pretty good. Starting at 40 means you get 10 extra health, or 33% more health. That's a lot of extra health. Much of the time, control decks are struggling to stay alive, as aggro is pushing their last few points of damage. So with 10 extra health, I feel like this is a pretty significant buff against aggro decks. And it is worth noting that with the downside of adding weaker cards to your deck, you're not necessarily going to draw the weakest cards every game, but you are going to have 40 health every game. So it seems like a pretty reasonable trade-off. As far as what deck would actually want to play this, I'm not really sure, because the game tends to be very synergy-based right now, and most decks have like 1 or 2 cards that are just way more powerful than everything else in the deck. Like Mech Mage is certainly not going to play this card because they want to draw Mecha Shark every game. And I don't even know that Control Paladin would want to play this card because they really want to hit Lightforged Cariel, and having 10 extra cards makes that more difficult. But with 10 extra health, you probably do have at least 1 extra turn to find something like Lightforged Cariel. So it might be worth it, and I would say at the moment that's probably the prime candidate for this card. I've also seen that some Control Warriors are popping up again, maybe they would be interested in this. But it's hard to say. We won't have to wait too long to find out though, because my understanding is that this card is available to play right now. Next up we have Primordial Wave for Shaman. 3-mana nature spell that says transform enemy minions into ones that cost 1 less, and friendly minions into ones that cost 1 more. So my first impression of this card is that it's pretty good. For 3 mana, it's an evolve and a devolve strapped together. And we know that plenty of decks already play the Starfish that silences the whole board. Devolving a board is probably about as good as silencing it, if not better. You do lose the 2/4 body, but you also get to evolve your own board. And even if you're just hitting like a totem or something, that's probably pretty close to making up for it. And if you hit something like Tiny Toys, then suddenly this card looks extremely powerful. We have seen a little bit of other Evolve synergy for Shaman already, so I imagine if they're pushing an Evolve Shaman archetype, this will be a core card in it. But it might even be good outside that. You're probably not going to play it in something like Murloc Shaman because evolving those will probably make them worse. You're probably not really interested in evolving something like a Snowfall Guardian or a Macaw that copied a Snowfall Guardian. But I can definitely envision a Shaman deck that would be interested in a card like this. Potentially even without caring about evolving your own minions. Priest of the Deceased. A neutral 2-mana 2/3 with Taunt that says Infuse 3, gain +2/+2. So Infuse is a new keyword in this expansion, and Infuse X means once X number of friendly minions have died, you gain this effect. it actually transforms into this other card, which will be a 2-mana 4/5 that says Infused and Taunt. So you need 3 friendly minions to die, and then you get a 2-mana 4/5 Taunt. So my first impression of this card is, I think it's pretty good. Is this the new Corridor Creeper? Corridor Creeper was both sides of the board, but in a lot of matchups, it's going to be easier to have 3 friendly die than 7 total die. Of course, this still costs 2 mana, but a lot of times you played Corridor Creeper for 1 or 2 mana. I think this card is potentially really sick. It's going to be at its best in Druid, because they can play Razormane Battle Guard, which makes your first taunt minion each turn cost 2 less. So this will be, in that deck, a 0 mana 4/5 taunt. You can also copy it with like Oracle of Elune, even without the Battle Guard. And Druid can also enable it through things like Living Roots that make 1/1s, through the Vibrant Squirrel, or even in slower Druid decks it can be enabled through something like Scale of Onyxia. So I think this card certainly will see play in Druid, but it might even just be good in aggro in general. Like imagine Murloc Warlock. Turn 1 they go Rock Bottom Tiny Fin, that gets cleared, and then you 2 mana 4/5 taunt. It's pretty good. The 4/5 taunt can also protect the Lushwater Scout, I think it is, the one that gives other Murlocs rush. So yeah, I mean, I think this card is pretty sick. I think there's a potential it sees a lot of widespread play, but I think it will almost certainly see at least some amount of play. Murloc Holmes, a neutral legendary. 3 mana 3/4 Murloc with Battlecry. Solve 3 clues about your opponent's cards to get copies of them. So the way this works is you basically do a discover effect 3 times. For the first one, you have to guess which card started in your opponent's opening hand. For the second one, you have to guess which card is currently in your opponent's hand. And then for the third one, you have to guess which card is currently in your opponent's deck. And it seems like the options they give you are all from their deck, from their starting deck of 30 or 40 cards. And if you guess all 3, then you add a copy of each of those to your hand. So if you were just guessing randomly, it would be a 1 in 3, and then a 1 in 3, and then a 1 in 3, which ends up being a 1 in 27, so like 4-ish%, which is pretty terrible. But that's why you have to use clues to figure it out. So the first one, guessing which card started in the opponent's hand, that's probably not going to be too hard. Very likely they will have played the card, and you can just, like, keep track of which card they played that was in their starting hand. But the second 2 are going to be quite a bit harder. Guessing which card is currently in your opponent's hand versus which card is currently in their deck is going to be pretty tough to figure out. Now, if they played like a Talon, and then you see that one of your options is Onyxia, then you can pretty easily say, okay, the Onyxia is probably in their hand. And for the one in deck, like say maybe you flooded the board last turn and they didn't clear it, so if you see Brawl, then you can probably say, Brawl is in their deck. And I guess there will also be situations where maybe from the Discover choices, you'll see cards they've already played. So like if your rogue opponent has already played Krakatoa, and one of the options is Krakatoa, then you know Krakatoa is not in their hand or in their deck. So there are a lot of things you can do to kind of narrow this down, but I do think a lot of times you're going to have to just be guessing on what's currently in their hand versus currently in their deck. Like even with 1 clue on each of those, it's still 50-50 into 50-50, which is only a 1 in 4 of this being better than Spider Tank. Although I guess even if you're wrong, it does give you some very small amount of information. But basically what I'm getting at is, in general, I think it's going to be pretty hard to draw 3 cards off this. So I think it will likely be more of a fun card than a competitive card. It is also a Murloc. I don't think you're playing this in like Murloc Shaman or Murloc Warlock, but maybe you're playing it in a deck that wants to play Gorlock Ravager. And this is like your 3rd Murloc, and maybe it's fine. Sometimes things work out, or sometimes you find yourself in a good situation where the effect makes sense, and maybe it'll be pretty good in something like that. But I don't think it's not going to be a Spider Tank that draws 3 very consistently, I would say. Next up is going to be Sanguine Depths for Warrior, which is our first location card. So the way locations work is you put them in the field sort of like a dormant minion, or like the portal that Warlock can make that summons Flame Imps. It takes up a minion slot, but it's not really a minion. It can't be targeted through battle. It's not going to die if your opponent plays Twisting Nether or whatever. It sits on the board, and once per turn, you can use the effect of the card, and it loses 1 durability. So this is a 1 mana with 3 durability that says deal 1 damage to a minion and give it +1 attack. So when this is in play, a total of 3 times over 3 separate turns, you can deal 1 damage to a minion and give it +1 attack. And I think this does seem like reasonably good value. For 1 mana, you can deal 3 damage, split as you like among different things. It can be pretty good for cleaning up a board clear. They did nerf Shield Shatter, so maybe Shield Shatter needs a little bit of help clearing. You can also use this on your own minions, so maybe it's the return of Acolyte of Pain and Warrior. You can play your Sanguine Depths on 1, and it doesn't cost anything to activate the effects on these, I believe. So turn 3, you could just play Acolyte, shoot it, make it a 2/2, and you immediately draw a card. That can be pretty powerful. It can also be really good with Kresh, the big legendary that has Frenzy gain, I think it's 8 or 9 armor. Sometimes you play that card and you just die before it takes damage, but with this you can damage it. Even if you like coin it out on turn 5, you can immediately damage it. I do worry that maybe it's just a little bit low impact of a card for something like Control Warrior to want to play it. But in theory, it does good stuff that can affect either side of the board, which is what you would want. And in something like Control Warrior, it's something you can just throw out, and then even if you don't need it for the next like 4 turns, you still have access to it throughout the game until you actually use all 3 charges of it. So I think this card is pretty good. Next for Warrior, we have a legendary, Decimator Olgra. 6 mana 3/7 with Battle Cry, gain +1/+1 for each damaged minion, then attack all enemies. And all enemies includes the opponent's hero. So this can go face as well as clearing their board. And it also pairs pretty nicely with the location we just saw, because you can damage something and then Olgra will gain +1/+1 and attack. Although I guess it gains +1/+1 and you gave their thing +1 attack, so maybe it isn't actually that good with that card. But even if this thing isn't gaining stats, it's still like reasonably good. 6 mana, deal 3 damage to a bunch of stuff is like pretty playable in Warrior, I think. You're not excited if that's all it ever does, but obviously it has a ceiling higher than that sometimes. And it does gain stats for each damaged minion, not each damaged enemy, even though when it attacks it only hits enemies. So again, if we're playing the Acolyte of Pain thing, you can damage your Acolyte, and then that will also give Olgra +1/+1 later. And if maybe in a previous turn you played like Rancor to clear the board and it didn't quite kill your opponent's like 3 health Murlocs, then Decimator Olgra is a pretty good follow-up to that. That's going to finish off those minions and even do maybe like 6 damage to your opponent's face. I definitely don't think this card is insane, because sometimes when you play it to clear the board, it's just going to smack into something and die. If your opponent even has just like a few Murlocs with a Murloc War Leader, this thing is going to die pretty early on. And I think in general, Warrior does a lot of clearing with like Brawl or with Shield Slams that do 1,000,000 damage. I don't know how likely you are to end up with a bunch of damaged minions on your opponent's side of the board, but maybe I'm underestimating how many damaged minions the Warrior itself can have, going with the like Acolyte of Pain, Armorsmith route. I actually don't know if Armorsmith is in the game right now. But yeah, this card has some potential, but I definitely don't think it's nuts. Baroness Vashj, a Shaman legendary. 4 mana 3/6 Naga. If this would transform into a minion, summon that minion instead. So earlier we saw the Shaman spell that was Evolve and Devolve. So if you would play that with Vashj in play, you would try to evolve her, but instead of evolving into a 5-drop, she would stay in play and summon a 5-drop. And there is also another Shaman Evolve card that we're probably going to see next. So all I can really say is if Evolve Shaman is a thing, this card is probably pretty good. I don't think prior to this set there's any Evolve stuff in Standard for this, so it's definitely going to need some support. But it is just a 4 mana 3/6. It is a Naga. I don't think Naga matters at all for Shaman, but I guess you can draw into it with Crush Claw Enforcer, which is maybe pretty good in your Evolve Shaman deck. So yeah, if Evolve Shaman's good, this card is good. If it's not, it's probably not. I guess it's also good against Evolve Shaman, because if they try to devolve this, then you just get a 3-drop instead of that, so that could be pretty good. I don't think there are any other... I guess there's Mass Polymorph this card could be pretty good against, but I think mostly you're trying to evolve it yourself. Alright, next up we have Muck Pools, the Shaman location card. Again, this costs 1 mana, has 3 durability, and says transform a friendly minion into one that costs 1 more. So you can see the obvious synergy with Vashj. You play this on 1, and then turn 4 you play Vashj and make a 5-drop. That actually seems kinda nutty. And then if they don't deal with Vashj, they can't really deal with Muck Pools, at least from the current card pool we've seen. So they're threatening for you to just make another 5-drop following that. This could be pretty sick. Like, maybe it's not even a full-on Evolve Shaman. Maybe you just play Muck Pools Vashj in, like, a normal Shaman deck, and sometimes you high-roll the shit out of the opponent. I don't think there's any, like, Serenite Chain Gang or Doppelgangster or Desert Hare kind of stuff in the game at the moment. But if any of that stuff starts to show up, this card is starting to look really, really powerful. Like, people played Mutate in their deck for 0 mana. For 1 mana, you get 3 Mutates, and there's synergy with this now. Maybe you can play Goldshire Knoll in Shaman. I think this card has a lot of potential to be pretty nutty. Next, we have a rogue spell, Door of Shadows. 1 mana shadow spell that says draw a spell, infuse 2, add a temporary copy of it to your hand. So again, infuse 2 means if 2 friendly minions die, then this upgrades. And it adds a copy of the spell you draw until the end of your turn, I believe is how that works. So on its own, it's 1 mana, draw a spell. That's like pretty good already. I mean, Tracking and Gone Fishing are good cards. But then if you upgrade this, then you can potentially, for 1 mana, draw a permanent Wicked Stab and a temporary Wicked Stab. So 1 mana, draw 8 damage seems pretty darn good. It does also specifically draw a spell, so there's a decent chance that you can target Sunken Vessel with this. You can target powerful cards like Preparation or Shadow Step. I mean, it's just hard to imagine this card not seeing play. Even without infusing it, it's pretty good. And then when you do infuse it, you just get copies of OP rogue spells. Not really much to say about this. I just think, like, every rogue deck plays this. And I believe we are on to the final new card that's been shown so far, the Suspicious Usher, or Priest. A 1 mana 1/3 with Battle Cry. Discover a legendary minion. If your opponent guesses your choice, they get a copy. So the way this works is you play it on your turn, you discover the legendary, and then at the start of your opponent's turn, then they get the discover choice, and they get to choose which one you picked. So it's not like this interrupts your turn for your opponent to pick. And apparently, they only get the chance to discover, to like guess your choice, if the Usher survives the turn, which seems like kind of a strange choice, but I don't know how easy it'll be for the priest to get rid of the Usher, so that probably won't come up too much, but maybe it does. And the good thing is, even if they correctly guess, you still get your copy. So you get your copy regardless, and then in theory, they only have a 1 in 3 chance to get their copy. So I think this card is probably like pretty decent. 1 mana 1/3 is fine. It's a value card for priest. It is a discover, so you're only getting neutral and priest legendaries. Priest has some pretty nutty things to discover, like Valish, I think is the 0 mana one that gives you more mana. Maybe it could also be a decent filler card for Quest Priest. You can discover, you know, the thing that you need at the moment. It might also come with some fun mind games, where you can choose like the second best option, and then your opponent assumes that you took the best option, but you didn't, you took the second, so they miss on their discover and they don't get a card, but you do. Also in the late game though, if you play this and then immediately play the legendary, then like they'll just know what you discovered and they'll always get the copy of it. It's a pretty interesting effect, and I think it is competitive. It's just a dire mole that draws a card, and that card is probably fairly likely to be pretty good. So yeah, that's all for the new cards so far. I obviously am looking forward to the new expansion. Hopefully with the larger card pool, it will no longer be viable to just search Mech or Murloc in your collection and click on everything that has that keyword, but that remains to be seen. I'm also pretty interested in the location cards. I think there's a lot of potential. The ones they've shown so far are pretty cool. And Infuse, so far, doesn't really seem like that interesting of a keyword. But the ones they've shown, at least, have potentially been pretty powerful. And of course, in the coming days, I will certainly be trying out Prince Renathal to see if 40 health is worth 40 cards.